From today and in few days, we are going to discuss Entity Framework Core, and it is one of the most important concepts in .NET applications, right? So, because see, whenever we are going to develop any kind of a data-driven application where database is involved, so it is important for us to understand how we can communicate with the database, how we can save the data, and how we can fetch the data from the database. And for data access technology, right, to interact with the database, we have many options. What are the options? We can use ADO.NET Core, we can use Dapper framework, we can use Entity Framework Core uh, also, right? But out of these three options, the most demanded and most of the .NET applications nowadays using Entity Framework Core. So basically, right, Entity Framework Core means don't think that ADO.NET Core is not being used, right? So all these three options, right, Entity Framework Core, ADO.NET Core, and Dapper, right, are used to communicate with the database. And every options, right, every flavor having its own advantages and disadvantages. So we will discuss one by one, right? First, we will discuss Entity Framework Core, then we will discuss Dapper, and then we will discuss ADO.NET Core. And once we discuss these three options, then we will discuss when to use which options in real-time applications. So mostly whenever you are going to work, you mostly going to use this entity framework core concept, right? So let us try to understand, right, what exactly entity framework core is, what is an ORM approach, why we need an ORM approach, right? Or what are the different application development approaches, what are a database provider, right? Why we should go with Entity Framework Core over Entity Framework 6.x. Then finally, we will discuss what is the difference between Entity Framework Core and our earlier .NET Entity Framework, right? So before proceeding further, if I will ask you this question, what exactly Entity Framework, then what will be your answer? I'm not talking about Entity Framework Core. I'm talking about the earlier Entity Framework. What exactly Entity Framework? Can anybody tell me? Anybody having any idea what exactly Entity Framework is?
It is also like ORM tool only, sir. Like based
Yeah.
on the tables, it will create the model classes.
Okay.
And also based on the classes, it will create the database table also.
Yes, yes, you are right. So basically, entity framework means what? That is one ORM tool. ORM is object relational mapper, which is basically going to map your .NET objects to the relational database tables. Or in you other word, you can say based on your object, right? Based on your model classes, it is going to create the database table. Alternatively, right? Alternately in the sense the other approach or the reverse thing is also true. Reverse thing means based on your based on your relational tables, it is also going to create the database objects, and it also provide a easier way to perform the database CRUD operations, right? So we will see what all these things and how we are going to achieve this, right? Let us first try to understand what exactly entity framework. So entity framework is an object relational mapper. We will discuss what is ORM in some time, right? So basically entity framework or entity framework core is an object relational mapper, and this entity framework core is basically used as a data access technology in .NET Core applications, right? If you are developing .NET Core applications, then you can use this entity framework core, right, to interact with the database. It was released along with .NET Core, right? As long as the .NET version is released, right? .NET Core is also released. It is an extensible, lightweight, open source, and a cross-platform version like the .NET Core. Entity Framework Core is also open source. Entity Framework Core is also cross-platform, right? And you can also, in other words, say that the earlier Entity Framework is not open source. The earlier Entity Framework is not cross-platform. That was not lightweight. But this entity from a core, right, you can consider it is the lightweight open source and a cross-platform version of the earlier entity framework data access technology, right? So whatever not available with the earlier entity framework, now that was not lightweight, that was not open source, that was not cross-platform. But this .NET Core entity framework, or you can say this entity framework core is lightweight, open source, and cross-platform, right? As it was cross-platform, so works on multiple operating systems. So guys, I'm not going to discuss what is open source, what is cross-platform. We have already discussed, right? Lightweight means it is very less weight, right? So that whenever you are right going to publish the DLL, right, it will not take more size. Extensible means you can easily use third-party APIs along with your .NET Core, right? So it works on multiple operating system. Why? Because it is cross-platform. You can work with Windows, you can work with Mac, and you can work with also Linux operating system. The ORM tool, or you can say the entity framework is an ORM framework, means what? It means it will map .NET objects to the relational databases. This entity framework core is designed to work with .NET Core applications, but also can be used with the .NET Framework applications if you are developing applications with the .NET Framework version 4.5 or higher. Right? So basically, Entity Framework core is designed to work with the .NET Core applications. But if you are developing .NET Framework applications using the version 4.5 or higher, then also you can use Entity Framework core. Right? So for a better understanding where you can use this Entity Framework core, please have a look at this diagram. Right? Suppose you are using Windows, Mac, and Linux operating system. If you are using this thing, definitely the framework is going to be .NET Core. In .NET Core, you can use Entity Framework Core to develop different kind of applications. You can develop ASP.NET Core applications, Web API applications, MVC applications, Razor Pages application, Blazor application, console application, etc. If you are using Windows operating system and the target framework is .NET 4.5, then also you can use Entity Framework Core to develop a different kind of .NET framework based applications like console, Windows Form, WPF, ASP.NET Web Form, ASP.NET MVC, ASP.NET Web API, etc. Universal Windows platform under this Xamarin, I don't have a much experience into this, right? So basically, if you are developing applications using Universal Windows platform, then you can also use this Entity Framework code to develop devices or IoT-based applications, right? Surface of applications, mobile applications, and even if you are developing mobile applications like Android, iOS, Windows, right? Then you can also use this Xamarin and this entity framework core application. So I don't have any experience this last two. I have experience with these two, right? Even as a .NET developer, we are going to work with these two options, not the other two one. Now we need to understand what exactly an ORM tool, right? The term ORM stands for Object Relational Mapper. What it means it automatically creates the classes based on database table, and vice versa is also true. What it means it will also generate the necessary SQL to create the database based on the classes, right? So based on your classes, it will create the database table. Based on the database table, it is also going to create the .NET classes, right? As a developer, right? So as a developer, we mostly work with the data-driven applications. So what do we mean by data-driven applications? So data-driven application means if you are developing an application which involves database, right? Which involves database, then that application is said to be a data-driven application. And as a .NET developer, whenever we are going to develop any kind of application, definitely database will be involved there. If database is not there, then as a backend developer, our role is not there, right? You can develop a static website by using simply HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. In that case, if database is not required, .NET developer is also not required. If .NET developer required, means database is required where we are going to develop, right? The application which is going to interact with the database. So in the data-driven applications, this ORM framework like Entity Framework or Entity Framework Core going to generate the necessary SQL to perform the database CRUD operations, right? So if you are working with data-driven applications and if you are using some ORM framework, then those in ORM framework can generate the necessary SQL statement to perform the insert operation update operation, delete operations, as well as select operations, right? And whatever the core is, whatever the SQL statement they are going to be generate, they are going to generate, are going to be understand by the underlying database, right? So, for example, the same application, right, code you have written, and if you want to execute the same set of code, right, whatever ORM framework, right, so it is going to generate the SQL statement in the sense what? We are going to write some C sharp code. That C sharp code will be converted into SQL. That SQL is going to be executed on the database. The C sharp code, what we are going to write, we are not writing depending on the database, right? Don't think that if database is SQL Server, right, we are going to write this C sharp code. If database is MySQL, we need to write that SQL, that C sharp statements. If database is Oracle, then we need to change the C sharp code. It is not like that. The C sharp code, what we are going to write is going to be common. We are not thinking about, we should not be worried about what should be the backend database. Our C sharp code is going to be same. And the same C sharp code is going to be converted into SQL statement, which is going to be understood by the underlying database, right? If you are using SQL Server, then that C sharp statement, whatever we written, right, is going to be converted into SQL, right, which is going to be understood by the SQL Server. For example, if you are writing to fetch the top 5 records, then in SQL Server, that C sharp statement will be converted into top 5 clause. But that top of five, right, what clause we used with SQL Server is not available in MySQL. MySQL, there is something called fetch. That means that same C sharp statement is also going to be converted into fetch, right, formatted, which should be understood by the MySQL. So as a developer, we should not be worried about what SQL statement is going to be generated. It will be taken care by the ORM framework. Clear, guys? Clear or
Yes,
not?
sir. Yes.
Okay. So basically, that is what ORM tool means. It is object relational mapper. Automatically create the classes based on database table, as well as based on the database table. It is also going to create the related, right, classes. It also generate the necessary SQL, right, which is going to perform the database crawl operations, right? And in that case, we should not be worried about what will be the backend database, how the SQL statement is going to be generated, how the SQL statement is going to be executed on the backend database. That will be taken care by ORM, right? And what entity framework core? It is a ORM. So now we need to understand why we need to use ORM tool. Let us understand this with one example, right? So suppose we are having this student class, this branch class, and this address class. So you can see this student class having few properties, branch class is also having few properties, and this address class is also having few properties. Now let us understand why we need to use ORM framework. Suppose we want to develop one application to manage the student of a college, right? So we are developing an application for managing the, right, students of a college. So to do this, what we need to do, we need to create a different classes. What are the classes we should create? We should create student, department, address, right? Like whatever the required classes for the business, right? That what you need to do. And technically, and technically, we call these classes as a domain classes or business classes, business objects or business classes, or you can say domain classes. So as these are representing the domain, right, of our business, we can also call them as a domain classes. Business. So see whether you said domain classes or business object or whatever, but technically these are nothing but only classes. Right. Without using the ORM framework, right? If you are not using any kind of ORM framework like entity framework or entity framework code, then what we need to do? We have to write lots of data access code for from the database operations, right? So we need to write the required SQL statement which is going to interact with the database. Whenever I'm saying required SQL statement, what it means? It means you have to use either ADO.NET or Rapport. If you are using ADO.NET, right? Then what you need to do? You need to create the connection object. You need to prepare the command object. You need to execute the command object. You need to fetch the data, right? Whether right SQL reader or SQL data adapter, whatever options you want to use, right? Everything you need to do manually. Along the same line, you also need to write the ESQL statements, right? Whatever is you want to execute on the database, that what you need to do. If you want to perform some batch operations, right, batch operations, then also you need to take the responsibility of how you are going to execute multiple database record on the database, right? Whether you need to use something called a data table or what. If you want to implement the transactions, right, you want to make sure that multiple database operations should be executed at a single unit, then you also need to take the responsibility to do all these things, right? So as a developer, writing this code is a time consuming as well as right time. Definitely it is going to be take lots of time. Obviously, if you compare with the edu.net, right, whatever we are doing manually and whatever this entity framework is going to do, definitely entity framework is going to take a little bit more time, but that is negligible. But why? Because the benefits, the flexibility, what we are getting with the entity framework core, we are not going to get with edu.net. Definitely, if he is providing everything ready-made, right, we can directly use. So it will take some little more time, which can be negligible, right? So basically, if you are not using any entity framework core, if you are not using any ORM framework, you can say, then everything you need to write manually. So you need to write lots of data access code from the database CRUD operations, right? So you need to write the things which is right going to perform the insert, update, delete, and read operations. Right. For example, to perform the CRUD operation, right? So CRUD operation means what? Insert, update, delete, and read operation from a database. We generally need to write custom code in our application to generate the required SQL statement, which are going to be understood by the underlying database. Again, guys, here the important thing is you have written the code, and currently, right, in day one, your database you are targeting is MySQL. So accordingly, you have written the code inside your application. After 1 year or after 2 years, your management decided, let move from MySQL to SQL Server. Then what you will do? If you are adding some TSQL statement in your application, don't think that all the TSQL statements are going to be understood by and executed by SQL Server, because the syntax is going to be vary from database to database. Then how much effort you have to provide to make your application run smoothly? So in that case, you need to check every statement of whatever you written, right? Again, second thing, right? What you need to do? Second thing, assume that in MySQL you have created lots of storage procedures, right? And you are just using those storage procedure from your .NET applications. Then do you think that the storage procedure, whatever you written, right, whatever you write using MySQL, the same syntax and the same statement you copy and execute on the SQL Server, and it is going to be executed or it is going to be created the storage procedure? No. The syntax of writing the story. See, most of the time, the TSQL statement you can find same, right? Mostly is TSQL statements are going to be the TSQL statement. 78% you can find same across the databases, but SQL, but the storage procedure, the way we are creating the storage procedure completely vary from databases to database. That means the effort, how much you need to give in your .NET application, as well as the effort, how much you need to give to your databases to convert those storage procedures, storage function into a database specific storage procedure function whenever we are moving from one database to another database, how difficult it is for you. So we need to think a better approach where irrespective of the database, our application code should not be changed. Where we should not need to be worry about the storage procedure. Means what? Means we are not going to write a storage procedure, because if the database change, then who is going to take who is going to give that much of effort to rewrite the same storage procedure based on the new database? So we should not be right. We should not be think much about the storage procedure. Why I'm saying, why I'm giving focus on storage procedure again and again, because if you are using ADO.NET, right, from the beginning, I've said that you can write the TSQL statement in the .NET application. But now you might be arguing, sir, I'm not going to write a TSQL statement. I can write directly, I can create the storage procedure and I can use the storage procedure from my application using ADO.NET. That is absolutely fine, right? Nowadays, nobody is writing the TSQL statement. Everyone is using storage procedure and functions. That is absolutely fine. So whatever, but what will happen if you move from one database to another database? In that case, you also need to modify the storage procedure, right? So if you are writing TSQL statement in your application, then you also need to think about how you can convert that TSQL statement to the TSQL statement which is going to be understood by the underlying database. Give me 1 minute, guys. So we need a better solution, and that solution is entity framework core. So if we are using entity framework core, right, then we do not need to be worried about the SQL statements that are going to be generated, that are going to be executed on the database. We do not need to be worried about the right table structure, because based on our classes, the table structure is also going to be generated automatically, right? We also need not to be worried about how the SQL statement is going to be generated to perform the database CRUD operation whenever we move from one database to another database. Everything is going to be handled by the entity framework core, right? So basically, it eliminates the needs to write most of the data access code we usually write without an ORM. If we are not using ORM tool, then whatever code we have written to perform the CRUD operation, right, to insert operation, update operation, delete operation, select operation, whatever, everything is going to be eliminated if we use the term ORM, right? If we use ORM framework like Entity Framework and Entity Framework Core, they are going to do all these things behind the scene for us, which is not only save a lot of time, but also, right? But also it will give more benefit whenever we are moving from one database to another database. Because this problem we face in our company, right? Earlier, right, in my one of my previous company, they are using SQL Server database, but later they moved from SQL Server to MySQL. So in that case, what problem we face that we know, right? So basically, we need to use this ORM framework. So what exactly this ORM framework? It will sit in between our database and our application code. So we are going to write application code. There is some backend database, and this entity framework core is going to be sit in between our application code and the database. And this entity framework core will take all the responsibility, right? Based on this database table, it is going to create the database, or the reverse process is also true. Means based on the database table, it can also create this database table. It can create this .NET classes. Also, this entity framework core will take the responsibility for from the database CRUD operations. But guys, remember, don't think that this entity framework core is going to do everything automatically. We also need to give some information, right? What will be the database? Where the database is created, right? What should be the idea, right? Credential to communicate with the database. You are if we are performing some CRUD operation, then on which table you need to perform the insert operation? On which table you need to perform the update or delete operation? All those informations, as a developer, it is our responsibility to provide it to the entity framework core. Once you provide all the required information to the entity framework core, then entity framework core only going to do the all the required things, right? Going to perform the database CRUD operations. Clear, guys? Why we need entity framework core,
Yes.
right? So basically, it is going to do lots of work, right? If someone asks you this question, why we need entity framework core, then you need to explain like this, right? Now why entity framework core, right? Let us try to understand. Entity framework core is an ORM tool that increases the developer's productivity, right? As you are not worried about how write the SQL statement, how to write execute the SQL statement on the database, how to capture the data and store on the .NET object, right? All these things are going to be taken care by the entity framework core. Means what? Means the developer's productivity is going to be increased. It is going to reduce the redundant task of doing the CRUD operation, right? Generally, whatever the statement we need to write to perform the CRUD operation, that is going to be reduced a lot, right? Entity framework core can generate the necessary database commands for doing the database CRUD operation. That means, right? That means entity framework core is going to generate the select, insert, update, delete statement for us. But the guys, remember, it is not going to generate all these things automatically. We need to tell when to generate the select statement, when to generate the insert, update, and the delete statement, and what scenario it is going to generate the insert, update, delete statement. Everything, right, is going to be tracked by the entity framework core. How it is tracked, how it is generated, we'll see practically, right? While working with the entity framework core, we can perform different operations on the database object, basically classes representing database table using link queue to entity, right? So basically, don't think that only insert after delete operations are there. Apart from there, many other operations we can also perform on the database object, right? Like filtering the data, right? Using the where link queue extension method, right? Grouping the data, joining operation, right? Many things we can perform using the link queue to entity by using this entity framework core. Entity framework core will generate and execute the SQL command in the database and then store the result in the instance of your domain object, right? So basically, if you are executing some SQL statement and you expect that this SQL statement is going to return me the list of students and their corresponding addresses, then those data will be returned from the database, and whatever the model you have created for the student and the address, right? Those are going to be automatically filled, right? How it automatically filled, everything practically we are going to see. Clear, guys? Now, what we need to do, we need to understand the entity framework core development approaches, right? So guys, remember, out of the box, right? Model first approach is not provided here. Here we have only code first approach and a database first approach. Means what? Based on the application code, the database is going to be generated in this approach. And the database first approach means, first of all, you need to create the database, and based on the database, your .NET classes are going to be generated. Now, let us first understand what is entity framework code first approach. Guys, remember, there is no such model, right, available. Based on the model, the classes are going to be created. Based on the model, the database is going to be created. This option is not available with entity framework core. And again, the entity framework core only keep focus on this approach, code first approach, not on the database first approach. So guys, the point that you need to remember is that there is no EDMX file. There is no entity data model using which you can communicate with the database, right? So in that case, we need to use reverse engineering using something called the entity framework scaffold. Based on that scaffold, you can create the required database classes, right? So we'll see all these things practically. Now, let us try to understand what is entity framework core database first approach, right? In entity framework core code first approach, sorry, first let us try to understand this code first approach. In entity framework core code first approach, first we need to create our domain classes. See, you can see this is my, if you are developing one application for a university, right, college, university, then whatever classes required for your college, like student, teacher, classes, courses, right, standard grade, all these things you need to create fast. Along with these classes, domain classes, you need to create a special class called a DB context class. And this DB context class, what you created, this is a custom class, and this custom class should be inherited from the DB context class. So basically, you need to create the domain classes and the DB context class. Then based on this DB context classes, right, and the domain classes means your student, branch, address, all these things. DB context class means it is a context class which is inherited from the DB context based class. And within this DB context class, we need to register the domain classes, right? If you created five domain classes and you want, I don't want tables for these five domain classes. I want table for two domain classes. I want table for three domain classes in the database. Then whichever domain classes you want to be created as a database table in the database, all those domain classes you need to register within this DB context class. Along this, within this DB context class, we also need to give the information about the database, about the backend database. Where is the database server? What should be the database server? What should be the database name, right? What the credential I need to use to communicate with the database? All those informations we need to provide within this DB context class. Then once we provide these things, then this entity framework core will come into the picture. Based on the DB context class, he can know what are the right domain classes registered within this DB context class for which I need to create the database table. So this entity framework core uses something called a database migration. What is database migration? We will discuss practically. It will generate the right corresponding database tables and columns, right? So whatever the domain classes you registered here, those domain for each domain class, it is going to create the corresponding database table, and whatever properties within your domain classes for which you are creating the database, those properties are converted into database columns, right? So in this way, right, if you want to create your database from your domain classes, then you need to go with code first approach. Clear, guys? When to go with code first approach?
Yes, sir.
Right. Right. So next, what we are going to discuss, entity framework database first approach. So in the case of an entity framework database first approach, first of all, you need to create the database. Whenever you are creating the database, you need to tell what are the database tables, what are the columns in each database table, and all these things. Once your database is ready, then this entity framework core will, you need to give information to this entity framework core, so that this entity framework core will go and check the database and generate the DB context class and the domain classes. So in this case, first of all, our domain classes and the DB context class we need to create. Based on this thing, entity framework will create the database. In this case, already we have the database, and from this database, we want to create this DB context and domain classes. So in that case, we need to use something called entity framework database first approach. So these are the two different approaches that are supported in entity framework code. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right. So next, what we need to understand, what are exactly, right? If you see in between the database, this entity framework core or database, or you can say entity framework core or database, in between entity framework core and the database, there is something called a database provider. You can see entity framework core and this is the database. And in between these two things, there is something called entity framework core database provider. We will discuss what is the role and responsibility of this database provider in detail, right? So basically what I want to tell you is, this entity framework core database provider, this is database specific, right? So if you want to communicate, right, if you want to communicate with the database using entity framework core, then you need to use something called entity framework core database provider. This entity framework core database provider is going to generate the SQL statements, right, specific to the database. For example, if you are communicating with SQL Server database, then you are having one database provider which is going to interact with the SQL Server database, and you need to install this database provider from the UGET. Similarly, if you are communicating with MySQL database, a different MySQL database provider is there, that what you need to install in your application. Similarly, if you are communicating with the Oracle database, then you need to install Entity Framework Core database provider for Oracle. That means this database provider is right? Entity Framework Core database provider is database specific. If you are using SQL Server database provider, then that provider can only communicate with SQL Server database. That provider cannot communicate with MySQL database. Suppose today you develop the application targeting MySQL database, and in your application you need to install Entrepreneur Code database provider for MySQL. Tomorrow you change the MySQL to SQL Server. You do not need to do anything. You only need to replace this MySQL entity framework code database provider with the SQL Server database provider, and your application is going to work smoothly, right? You do not need to do any kind of a changes, right? So the database provider usually contains, right, functionality specific to the database it supports. Functionality common to all database in the entity framework core component, functionality specific to a database, right? That what this entity framework core is going to provide. And if you are using Azure SQL or SQL Server 12 onward, right, for SQL Server database, you can install the entity framework core, right, database provider for SQL Server for NuGet, and the provider is this one. Similarly, if you are using SQLite, then this is the corresponding database provider. If you are using some in-memory or database object, then this is the database provider. For NoSQL, you can use this one. For MySQL, right, you can use this one. For Oracle, you can use this one, right? And guys, if you want to see the list of all database provider, just go to this link and you will see all the database provider, right? So this is the NuGet package, and on which version this package is available, right, and supported database, right? You can see all the required, right, based on the corresponding database. You can see what is the database provider, and if you go to the right NuGet packages, then you just need to search this name and you need to install the new you need to install the database provider. So basically, for each database, corresponding database, a specific database provider is there. Whichever database your application is targeting, that specific database provider you need to install into your application. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right. So this is the list of, right. Today you are saying this one, tomorrow might be it's changed, right? Say this 6767, right? And some of the database provider are paid version, some of the are free version, right? That what you need to check. And if you are using SQL Server, right, then what you need to use? You need to this one, and this is completely free. So you can use this on SQL Server 2012 onwards. Right? So now we need to understand why we need to use Entity Framework Core over Entity Framework 6.x, right? So Entity Framework 6 is already a stable version, and that framework is fully tested, right? And that is going to be used from the many years in .NET Framework applications. Now the question is, already Entity Framework 6 is there. Why we need to go for entity framework core? Why we are not using that entity framework 6.x? Already, I've told you, if you are developing the .NET Core application, you can still use entity framework. But why I'm going to use entity framework core? Let us try to understand, right? So entity, first of all, you need to understand entity framework core is open source and cross-platform, which is not in the case of a entity framework. If you are developing application targeting different kind of operating systems, then you have only obvious choice is entity framework core. You cannot use that things. But apart from that features, right? Let us try to understand what entity framework core provides, right? Similar to Entity Framework 6.x, right? It is, see guys, the points that you need to remember is many of the features which are available in Entity Framework 6 are also available in Entity Framework Core. So what are the features available in Entity Framework 6 are also available in Entity Framework Core? These are the features, right? So what all these features, we will discuss all these things in detail, right? But you can see DB context, DB set, right? The way we are working with the DB context class, DB set properties, that what is their data model is there, coring, right? You can use LinQ to entities, change tracking is there, that shape changes concept is there, that migration concept is also available in Entity Framework Core, right? These are the concepts which are available in Entity Framework 6, but also available in Entity Framework Core, right? Now you also need to understand, right? What are the features that are available with the Entity Framework 6 but not available with the Entity Framework Core? Then these are the features, right? So you will not find that EDMX file, right? There is no EDMX file in Entity Framework Core. Object context is not available. Querying using entity SQL, entity to SQL is not available. Table per type TPT is not available. TPC is not available. Entity splitting is not available. Spatial data, sheet data. These are the concepts, right, which are available in Entity Framework 6, but not available in Entity Framework. Why? Because they thought that these concepts are not required because these are the concept, right, which is difficult for a developer to understand, as well as these concepts are not required, right, not used frequently. We can replace them with some better technique, better technology, easier manner for the developer, and this is the reason why they removed these things, right? So currently, these are not supporting, but it might be possible that later period of time, right? They might introduce one by one this concept to be supported in entity framework code, right? Then the entity framework also going to provide some unique features, right, which are not available in entity framework 6. So entity relationship configuration, batch insert, update, delete operation. This is the biggest advantages of entity framework, right? Core. In entity framework, the right add range, update range, delete the method what we use, right? They are not going to perform the batch operation. Internally, they are going to make one by one database call to the database, right? So, but batch operations you can typically implement using in entity framework core. In memory provider, inbuilt support for IOC, unique constraint, shadow properties, alternative keys, global query filter, field mapping, DB context pooling, right? Better patterns for handling disconnected entity graphs. So, right. So these are the features which are available with entity framework core. Sir, you don't ask me any questions or what exactly all of these features. So we are going to discuss each of these feature in detail, right? But I just want to make sure with you that if you are having good experience on entity framework, then you will understand these two concepts, right? So because in entity framework, these things are available. In entity framework, these things are available. But these things are available in entity framework core, but these are not available in entity framework core, right? So whenever we are going to work with the database, right? Don't think that the EDMX file will come into the picture, right? This spatial data, sheet data, entity splitting, these are not available with your entity framework code, but this concept, right? So if you want to see, right, a detailed difference, right, which features are introduced in which version, right? What is the difference between entity framework core and entity framework? Go to this link, and this link will give you a clear indication, right? Which versions are available in entity framework 6, whether these are available in entity framework core or not, right? See some of the features you can see: model format, EDMS, create model from database, right? These are available with what? With entity framework, but these are not supported with entity framework core, right? So you can go and check whatever the features, right, are available with entity framework and whatever the features which are not available in entity framework core, right? You can see a clear differences. Now, apart from that feature-wise differences, right? This link, whatever I've provided, in this link, you will see that feature-wise differences. Whichever feature are available in Entity Framework, which are the feature which are not available in Entity Framework Core. It is fine. But apart from this feature-wise differences, let us try to understand the other differences as well, right? What are the primary differences? Let me go one by one. Development platform. So, guys, tell me, Entity Framework 6 is a platform, right? Is a platform independent or cross-platform or not?
Not.
Yes. And what about the entity framework core?
Yes.
Right. So first difference means entity framework is not cross-platform. It is Windows based only. And this entity framework core is cross-platform. Means you can use Windows, Linux, and a Mac operating system. Right? Performance, although Entity Framework 6 is a feature-rich and robust framework, it has been criticized for its performance, right? Particularly, if you are going to perform the batch operation like using the add range method or remove range method, in that case, it is not going to send all the data to the database, right, with a single round trip. In that case, it is going to perform the operation one by one. If you are trying to insert 100 records, then it will make 100 database call from your application to the database server. But the same thing, right, with Entity Framework Core, in a single database call, it will send all those 100 records at once from your application to the database, right? Now you tell me, if you are to add 100 records, Entity Framework making 100 round trips, and with the Entity Framework Core, with a single round trip, right, all the 100 records are being inserted into the database, then which is going to give you better performance?
EF4.
Obviously, right? So Entity Framework 6 is an ORM framework, right? Net feature, right? So we have already discussed, right? Some of the features are not supported initially, but later they are added. Entity Framework Core also provides same set of features, but they introduce many new features, right? Like global query filter, shadow properties, right? Or you can say these are the new features which is provided by Entity Framework Core. Also, whatever the good features that are available in Entity Framework 6, they are kept as it is. Some of the features which is not required, they remove it, but they are adding many new exciting features. That means if you compare the feature wise, then definitely Entity Framework having unadded advantages. Database provider, although Entity Framework supports multiple database provider, integrating third-party provider can be a challenge, right? So whatever the built-in providers are available, you can use them. But if you want to use some third-party provider, then it is going to be a challenge. But Entity Framework Core has been designed to support various databases, including NoSQL, right? If you are using with the Entity Framework, you can use NoSQL. But with the Entity Framework Core, whether it is a SQL database, right, or whether it is a NoSQL database, the flexibility is provided. You can easily integrate also third-party database provider. In configuration, coming to configuration, Entity Framework 6 configuration can be done in two ways. One is code-based approach, another one is XML-based approach, right? But with the Entity Framework Core, they mainly target, right, to replace the XML-based configuration, right? You will not find that XML, right, that config file where you are having different section for the right entities, entity mapping, right? Nothing is there. Everything is going to be only code-based approach, right? So the main psychology behind the Entity Framework Core is to move away from XML-based configurations, right? So you will not find any XML-based configuration with Entity Framework Core. Community and features, right? Although Entity Framework is still maintained and receives regular update, but the primary focus of the Entity Framework team and community is on Entity Framework Core. Entity Framework Core is the future of an Entity Framework. It receives regular update, new features and performance improvement. But these things, right? Even you are getting little bit update related to this Entity Framework 6, but the right entrepreneur team, their main focus is on Entity Framework Core. So on regular basis, you will get new update, you will get new features, you will also get performance improvement, right? So now, if you are working on an existing project that already using Entity Framework 6 or one that is linked to .NET Framework, it is still a good option to use Entity Framework, right? If you already project is developed using Entity Framework 6, and if the project is targeting the .NET framework, then you can go with the Entity Framework 6. However, if you are developing a new project, particularly project targeting .NET Core or .NET 5 or 6 or 7, then Entity Framework Core is the best choice. Entity Framework Core's flexibility, performance improvement, cross-platform capabilities make it the perfect choice for the developers in modern application development, right? So these are the differences between Entity Framework Core and Entity Framework 6. So this is the introduction, right? Any question, guys, related to this 10 questions?
No,
Clear,
sir.
guys?
Yes, sir. No.
One question. Are we going to use Entity Framework Core for non-relational database like MongoDB?
No, no. We are going to keep focus on the SQL Server database.
Okay.
Okay. Right. So now let us try to understand. We have understand Entity Framework Core basic concept, right? What exactly Entity Framework Core? What are the different development approaches, right? what is the difference between entity framework and the entity framework core. Uh, all these things once you discuss, then we need to understand how to install entity framework core, right? So in how we can install entity framework core, how we can use entity framework core in our applications, right? In our MVC application, in our web API application, and all these things, right? So guys, what I have decided, I will explain the core concept using the console application, and the reason for this is I want you to keep focus on the entity framework core concept, not on all other concepts, right? If you are taking the MVC application, then you will not fully concentrate on entity framework core. Your mind will be work on what is the controller, what is the action method, right? What configuration changes is required. So instead of that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep focus on the console application. I will explain the core concept. Once the core concepts are explained, then I will show you how you can use entity framework core to perform the database CRUD operation using our ASP.NET Core MVC application, as well as going further. Once the basic concept is clear, every application that what we are going to develop, we are going to use the entity framework core options, right? So because right, so entity framework core, it's not related to your MVC application, it is not related to your web API application, it is not related to your Blazor application, it is not specific to your what I can say Razor Pages application. It is a concept only, right? And this framework you can use in any kind of a .NET applications. So I will explain the concept, right? I will explain the core concept in the next 7 to 10 days, right? I'm targeting at least 7 to 10 classes. I will try to complete, right, the core concept. Once the core concepts are completed, then I will explain how you can use the same thing in your MVC web API and different kind of applications. So first of all, let us try to see how you can use entity framework core code first approach. And once the code first approach was completed, then I will show you how you can use the database first approach, right? Is that clear, guys?
Yes.
Okay. So now what I'm going to discuss is how to install entity framework core in our console application using Visual Studio 2022. That console application is a .NET Core based application. The point that you need to remember, entity framework core is not part of the .NET Core or standard .NET framework, right? So don't think that if you are developing a .NET Core application or standard .NET framework based application, automatically this is get installed, right? It is not available automatically. Or whenever you install .NET Core SDK or .NET Framework SDK into your machine, don't think that entity framework core get installed. So we need to install it as a NuGet package from, right? We need to install entity framework core as a NuGet package. And we need to install two things. One is Entity Framework Core DB Provider. We'll discuss what is exactly EF Core DB Provider in detail. What are the role and responsibility of this database provider? We also need to install another tool called EF Core tool. I will also explain what is exactly this EF Core tool. So basically, we need to install two things. One is Entity Framework Core DB Provider. This Entity Framework Core DB Provider will give the flexibility, right? It is common to the database, right? Whatever database you are targeting, based on the database, this entity framework core is going to be used, and this is the common tools, right? Suppose you want to execute some kind of command in the uh, package manager console, or you want to execute some command in the .NET Core CLI. So for that command to be executed successfully, you need to use this tool. And this is specific to your database. Whatever database you are using, the corresponding database provider we need to install, right? So let us try to install these two. Then I will explain what is the role and responsibility of each one, right? So let me, okay. Open Visual Studio 2022. Right? Once you open the Visual Studio 2022, just click on this, create a new project option. And then you can see there are a different, I'm targeting Windows, and you can see there are a different web applications and many things. So I want to develop a console application, select the console. So here you can see there are two framework. You can use Entity Framework with the .NET Framework. If you targeting 4.5 or later, you can also use this on .NET Core, or you can say .NET. So I'm targeting this .NET Core. So next, once you select this one, then click on the next button. So once you click on the next button, provide the name, right? Whatever name you want to give your project, that name you need to give. I provided the name as Entity Framework EF Core Codefast Demo, and this is the location on D my project drive. I'm going to create this project, and then click on the next button. So here I don't want to use top level statement, right? This is the reason why I checked this checkbox, so that I will get the program class main method, right? And then click on this create button. So once you click on this create button, it is going to create the console application targeting .NET Core framework, right? So if you click on this one, then you will see the target framework is .NET 6, right? Output type means it is going to generate the exe file, and then you can see implicitly using is enabled, nullable checking is also enabled. I don't need to explain these things. And output type means what kind of output it is going to generate. It is going to generate what? Exe file. Why exe file? Because we are creating this as a console application, right? Now, what we need to do is we need to install, all right? We need to install two things. One is Entity Framework Core DB Provider, another one is Entity Framework Core Tools, right? So basically, first of all, we need to install this Core DB Provider, but to decide which Core DB Provider we need to use. So that will basically depend on the database, right? Whichever database you want to use, for that particular database, you need to select the appropriate entity framework or database provider. As we are going to use SQL Server database, so what I'm going to show you is the corresponding database provider. So you can see for SQL Server 2012 onwards, what database provider we need to use? We need to use this SQL Server provider. So just copy this name, right? So it is not limited. You can use EF Core, Postgres, MySQL, Oracle DB, right? Whatever the database your application is targeting, the corresponding database provider you need to install, right? So again, you can install in two ways using, right? Uh, uh, this package manager console, right here you can install, or you can install using the package manager, right, from the NuGet, right, like this two ways. So just go and select this one, right? Microsoft Entity Framework Code.SQL Server, right? So once you select this one, then you will see this is the package Microsoft.Entity Framework Code.SQL Server. This is the database provider for, right, Microsoft SQL Server provider for Entity Framework Code. That means this SQL Server database provider is basically used for Entity Framework Code. And what is the latest version? The latest version is 7.0.1, right? So if you want to use earlier version, you can use earlier version. But I'm using the 7.0.1 because I want to show all the latest feature actually. Because if I'm targeting 6.0 or earlier version, then the new features are not going to be supported. So this is the reason why I'm taking a console application as well as I'm taking the latest version, right? Once you select the latest version or any version as per your requirement, select the project where you need to install this one. I want to install on this EF Code Fast Demo project. If you are multiple project, then all the project will be listed here. And on which projects you want to install on a single project, two project, all the project, that checkbox you need to check. And then click on the install button. Once you click on the install button, it will start installing and it will give you the review pages first, right? So review in the sense, what are the DLLs or the corresponding DLLs it is going to install, that list it is going to show you. See, these are the DLLs or the, right, that what it is going to install. Just review this, and once you review this, just click on the OK button. So once you click on the OK button, then it will ask you the license agreement, right? So license agreement means you don't read, just click on the accept button, because nobody is going to read, right? Any license agreement is there, nobody never going to read those things. They simply click on the I accept button, which is a bad thing, but we are good at that. Okay, just click on this I accept button. Once you click on the I accept button, you can see the installation is finished. Once the installation is finished, right, then what you need to do, you need to verify whether the installation is completed or not. You just need to expand this package folder. And once you expand the package folder, then you can see that package is getting installed. Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQL Server. And within this, these are the sub packages. Right. So Entity Framework Core database provider is get installed. Right. So this is the step that what you need to follow. Right. And if you want to install this using package manager console, then what you need to do, go to this package manager console, just type this install package, and then you need to give the package. And in this case also, it is going to install the Microsoft SQL Server database provider package into your application. So both options are available. You can go with any option, right? You can install using NuGet package manager for solution, or using package manager console. But whenever you are using package manager console, you need to make sure the appropriate project, right? On which project you want to install. In this case, only one project option you can select, but if you are going with this option, at a time, you can also install the same package into multiple different projects, right? But here, using package manager console, only one project at a time. Clear, guys, how to install that database provider?
Yes, sir.
Right? So once you install the database provider, then we need to understand. And again, guys, if you want to see what are all the database providers, we have already discussed once. If you go to this link, then you will see what are the provider name, right? Based on the corresponding database, you just need to copy this provider and search on the browse tab. Now we need to understand what is the role of a database provider, right? When you work with the Entity Framework Core, the database provider act as a bridge between your Entity Framework Core API and the particular database management system, right? So if you look at the first diagram, right? So here I have shown you, right? So it acts as a bridge between your Entity Framework Core API and the corresponding backend database. So it sits in between the Entity Framework Core and the database, right? The primary role of a database provider is to convert the operations you define in your Entity Framework Core into commands that the underlying database can understand, right? So because, right, each database having a set of rules, set of features, syntax, configurations. And by taking all those syntaxes, rules, configuration, whatever statement we have written in our .NET application, this Entity Framework Core will convert that C# statement into the corresponding SQL statement by taking the corresponding database features, rules, syntax, so that it will generate the appropriate SQL statement, which is going to be understood and executed by the corresponding database. That means, in this case, whatever statement we have written using Entity Framework Core or in a .NET Core application, those statements will be provided to this Entity Framework Database Core provider. This Entity Framework Core Database provider will check, right, it is specific to a database. If we are using MySQL, then this database provider is MySQL specific, and this provider know how to generate statement that are going to be executed on the MySQL database. If SQL Server database, then you have to use SQL Server database provider, and SQL Server database provider know what are the rules, regulations, syntax, features that are used in SQL Server database, and accordingly it will generate the SQL statements that are going to be executed on the corresponding SQL Server database, right? So now let us try to understand what are the features. One is query translation. Query translation means what, right? Uh, we can write the statement, we can write the SQL statement. And those SQL statement are, right, we are not writing the SQL statement, we are writing some LinQ query or some C# statements, right? And those LinQ queries are get converted into SQL. How this conversion is happening? That is the job is done by the database provider, right? Whatever the statement we rewrite that are converted into the corresponding SQL. That means query translation is going to be performed by the database provider. Change tracking. Change tracking means what? Now we face, let's assume we are having a student entity in the database, and we fetch that student entity from the database into our application, and then we modify one of the property. So once we modify the property and when we call the set changes method, then it is automatically going to generate the update command, right? So for example, we are having that tables color set table properties, right? And we add a new entity to that table property by using the add method. Then automatically it is going to generate the insert statement. How this is performed? This is performing based on something called a change tracking. So whenever we fetch an entity or whenever we create a entity, this database provider also tracking what is the entity state, whether the entity being added, modified, updated, deleted, and based on this entity state, it is going to generate the required insert SQL statement if the state is added. It is going to generate the required update statement if the state is modified. It is going to generate the delete SQL statement if the state is deleted, and that's it. So all these informations are tracked by the entity, right, or tracked by the database provider, right? Database provider know what SQL statement I need to generate. And that how it is going to identify based on the entity state. Practically, we will see what is the entity state, how we can modify the entity state, how what SQL statement is going to be generated. Everything I am going to show you practically. But for now, just remember this is one of the feature, and this is possible because of the database provider. Connection management, right? See guys, remember, without opening the connection, can we perform the database CRUD operations? No. Because if you are working with ADO.NET, then as a developer, it is your responsibility to open the connection, execute the command, close the connection. Any transaction management is there, you have to manage them manually. But all these things are going to be taken care by the database provider. When to open the connection, how to open the connection, when to close the connection, how to manage the transactions, right? All these things are going to be internally managed by the database provider. As a developer, we never going to write any code to open the connection, close the connection, and all these things. That is going to be done by the database provider. Clear, guys? This first few uh, terms you understand what is query translation, what is change tracking, and what is connection management. If you are having still doubt, don't worry. Once we see practical examples, then you will understand these things. Right? But if you are coming from entity framework background, then you should know what all these things, because these are already available in entity framework. Right? Migration means what? Right? So basically, see why we are this entity from our core. It uses something called the database migration. So this migration, using this migration, we can easily manage and version of our database schema. So for example, initially we created created some columns, some classes, and based on the classes, the database is created. And we said this is my version one, migration version one. Later, we generate another database migration and we execute that migration. So the database is updated. Later, another version is created and the database is also again migrated to version 3. Later, after some period of time, you don't want that version 3, you want to downgrade to that second migration. That is also possible. Right? How to do this practically, I will show you. So based on this migration, you can manage your database schema very easily, right? How to do this practically, I will show you. Database specific features means, right? Some of the features, guys, remember, all the features are not common across all DBMS. The top record, if you want to fetch in a SQL Server database, is not the same in MySQL database. So, but if you want to guarantee that, irrespective of the database, right, the features should be right work as expected, then that is going to be taken care by the DB database provider. So, database provider will take the responsibility how to fetch the data, how to fetch the top 10 records from the SQL Server database, right? That database provider is also take the responsibility to fetch the top 10 record from the MySQL Server database. So we do not need to be worried about how to use that top clause in SQL Server or how to use that fetch clause in MySQL. We do not need to be worried. That will be taken care by database provider. Scaffolding means, guys, remember, entity framework with entity framework core, we do not have that flexibility of using EDMX file. So in that case, how we are going to generate the model classes based on our database? How we can generate the model classes based on our In that case, we need to use something called scaffolding. So using this scaffolding context, right, we can implement entity framework database first approach. Type mapping means, see, whenever we are creating a model class, that model class having multiple properties, and for these properties, the corresponding database table is going to be created, as well as the table having the corresponding columns. Guys, give me 1 minute. Right? So basically our class name, right, whatever the class we created, that will be created as a table in the database, and whatever the properties we are having with our class, those are going to be created as column in the database. But the thing is that type mapping, right? Type mapping means what type, if we are creating the data type as string in our class, then what should be the column type in the database? If you are creating here Boolean, then what should be the data type in the database? If you are creating a date time, then what should be the data type in the database? That mapping is also going to be done by this database provider, right? So these are the features, right, that what we can achieve, right, by or in other words, you can say these are the functionality or responsibility taken care by the database provider. Clear, guys? Yes or no? Guys, any question, guys?
Type mapping means mapping the data type, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So once we install, right, entity framework, database provider, then another tool that what we need to use is entity framework core tools, right? So because, right, entity framework core tools means if you want to execute some CLI command, that add migration, update migration, remove migration, right? And any kind of CLI commands or that console window, wherever we need to write some command. If you want to achieve that, then for that purpose, what you need to do, you need to use entity framework core tool. Right? So for that purpose, what you need to do is you need to use entity framework core tools. So the way we have installed, right? The way we have installed the database provider for SQL Server, in the same way, we also need to install this entity framework core tool. So what is the package? This is the common tool, right? This is not specific to your database. It is the common tool, irrespective of the database provider. Along with that database provider, which is a database specific, you also need to install this entity framework core tools, right? So just go to your NuGet package manager console or selection, just select this one and install this one, right? So again, here you will get a list of preview changes. You all need to click on this OK button, then accept the license, right? So once these two things, you can see two packages are get installed inside this packages slash dependencies folder. That means we have successfully installed. What we have successfully installed? We have successfully installed the required packages in order to work with the entity framework code, right? Even i- if you want, then you can also install the common tool package by using the console window, right? Now we need to understand what is the role and responsibility of this entity framework and EF core tools, right? This EF core tool provide a set of command line tools, or you can say .NET CLI tools, that assist developers in tasks related to entity framework, right? So what are the tasks it is going to perform? It is going to perform the task like creating the migration, updating the database with migration, querying the database, and many more, right? So let us try to understand what are the role responsibility. Database migration, right? Suppose we are going to create a migration, right? So what is database, what is migration, how to create the migration, we'll discuss practically, right? But for now, You can see if you want to create a migration, update the database, right, with that migration. If you want to remove a migration, and if you are using generating some SQL script, right, means what? If you want to execute some raw SQL statements, right, generating the SQL script means what? Now see, whenever we are update the database, right, based on that current or latest migration or whatever the migration we specified, that is going to, it will generate the SQL script and update that SQL script, execute that SQL script on the database. But sometimes what happens, we do not update flexibility, right, on the production environment. Production environment, we can't do such things. Then in that case, what we need to do, based on these migrations, right, we need to generate the SQL script, and we need to provide that SQL script to the product team by releasing some release note and getting approval from your manager, and the long process, right? And they are going to execute those script in the production environment. And in that case, if you want to generate what SQL script should be executed on the database, then you can also use this EF core tools. Database scaffolding, right? Right. This EF core tools, right? What it means if you want to execute some scaffolding, right? If you want to execute the model classes, create the model classes from the existing database, you want to use something called the database scaffolding. And for database scaffolding, right? Again, you need this tool because this command is going to be executed on the .NET Core CLI or using the package manager console, view DB context model, right? So if you want to visualize the graphical representation of your entity and relationship, then you can use something called view DB context model. And that is possible only if you are installing this EF core tools, right? And these EF core tools are available as PowerShell commands, right? PowerShell commands means what? You can execute this command in your package manager console, Visual Studio Package Manager console, or you can also execute them as .NET Core CLI commands. If you are using .NET Core CLI, then also you can use this command, right? So let us try to understand what are the commands, right? PowerShell command means if you want to add a migration, you need to use add migration. For update, you need to use update migration. For scaffolding, right, you can use scaffold DB context command. Similarly, if you want to do the same thing using .NET Core CLI, then these are the command that what you need to use. So to use EF Core tools, you need to typically install this one if you are using, right? If you want to use the tool in the PowerShell, and for .NET Core CLI, you need to install this one, right? So in this case, we are going to use the PowerShell commands, right? PowerShell command means is the our package manager console only we want to execute, right? For that purpose, you need to install this command, what we have already installed. But if you want to execute the command on the .NET Core CLI, then right, or if you are developing the application using Visual Studio Code, in that case, you need .NET Core CLI command, then in that case, you need to install this one. So we have installed the required database packages, right, which using which we can develop our application. So the next what we are going to discuss is DB context class. So guys, understand what is the role and responsibility of these two tools, or you can say these two packages. What is EF Core DB provider and what is EF Core tool? So basically, if you want to manage the database by using add migration, update migration, remove migration, right, scaffolding, all those things, if you want to do, in that case, you need to use Entity Framework Core tools. And this EF Core DB provider, it is specific to the database, right? Whatever database you are using, if you want to perform different kind of a database operations, right? Change tracking, right? Query translation, caching, right? All these things, if you want to implement, then in that case, you need to use this EF Core DB provider. So these are the two tools that you must install in order to work with the Entity Framework. Clear, guys? See, I can directly show you how to install this tool. Why I'm explaining all these things? Because you should know if I'm installing a NuGet package, then what are the rule and what are the responsibility, what are the things going to be done by that package? That what we need to understand. And this is the reason why I'm explaining and I'm providing this explanation, right? Clear, guys?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you should know all these things, right? If someone asks you what is the role of an entity framework or database provider, you need to tell this thing. If someone asks you what is the role of an entity framework or tools, then you need to explain these things, right? So, but currently you might not understand what is creating migration, what do you mean by updating the database, removing migration, right? Don't worry. Once you start developing the application, then again, I will show you all these things practically, right? Practically, we are going to create migration, update migration, remove migration, all these things we are going to discuss practically, right? So once we understand these things, right, next what we are going to discuss DB context class. So this is the heart, or you can say brain of your .NET Core applications, right? Before moving further, I just want to ask you, can anybody tell me what is the role of a DB context class in Entity Framework? I'm not talking about Entity Framework Core, I'm talking about Entity Framework. Why we are using a DB context class? Anybody having any idea? See, we are using database provider. Database provider is going to convert our statement into SQL, and then those SQL statement is going to be executed on the database. But how you are going to generate those SQL, how you are going to generate those C# statements, right? If I'm writing one statement, x equals to 10, whatever C# statement, do you think that that statement is converted into SQL? Right? It is not like that. Okay, whatever statement we write, all those statements are going to be converted into SQL statement. This is not the case. But when the statement is going to be converted into right SQL statement, when it is going to perform the CRUD operation, right? For all those things, we need one class called DB context class. This is the heart of the content, right? .NET Core application, and this DB context class is going to be used by the database provider to generate the required SQL statement. So basically, this is the important thing, or the thing that what I can tell you is DB context. You can consider this DB context is equivalent to your entity framework code. If you understand this DB context class, then you will understand everything. So let us try to understand what exactly this DB context class, what are the role and responsibility of this class, how we can create this DB context class in our applications. Let us try to understand. According to MSDN, right? MSDN means Microsoft Documentation, right? An instance of a DB context class represents a session with the database and can be used to query and save instance of your entities, right? So basically, this DB context class represent one session with the database. So once you create an instance of the DB context class, means one session is established with the database. And once session is established means what? Now your application is connected with the database. And then once you have a active session with the database from your application, then you can perform the database operations, right? You can query the data, right? Paste the data, you can insert the data, update the data, delete the data. And that is possible by using this DB context class. And this DB context class is a combination of a unit of work and a repository part. So I'm not going to explain what is unit of work and the repository pattern at this moment, right? So once we progress, then definitely I'm going to tell you, right, how to use repository pattern, unit of work with entity framework core. Practically, I'm going to show these things, right? So because if I explain this thing at this moment, right, you will not understand, right? So I will explain definitely these things. So the DB context class is an integral part of entity framework core application. The DB context class in entity framework core is used by our application to interact with the database. The class manages the database connections and perform the CRUD operations, right? Let us try to understand what are the tasks going to be performed by the DB context. Object set representation. Object set representation means what? Now see, for your application, suppose you are developing one e-commerce application. For your e-commerce application, you have created 100 models, starting from customer, product, admin, super admin, right? Payment, invoice, many different kind of models you created. But out of those 100 models, you want to create a database class tables for 20 models, right? For 20 models, you want a corresponding database table. Then in that case, for whichever model you want to create the database tables, that what you need to specify using the dbset.tentity properties within this DB context class. So within this DB context class, you need to specify dbset.t property, where t property is nothing but your entity name or model name. And once you specify this thing within this DB context class, and whenever you create a migration, then in that case, for this DB set of T entity property, or you can say for this model property, the corresponding database table is going to be created. So how many number of properties you specify, how many number of DB set property you specify within this DB context class, for each DB set of T entity property, the corresponding database table is going to be created. Clear, guys? Create or understand or not?
Yes, sir. Understood.
Yes. So first of all, we need to practically, again, see, practically I'm going to show you how you can create this thing. One, and the next one is change tracking. Change tracking means whenever you fetch one data from the database, then you can update the data, right? You can delete the data on that particular record. Suppose, for example, you fetch one employee information whose ID is 10, and then you modify some of the properties. Then what will happen? And whenever modify means that modification is performed on the entity, that is what is going to be kept track by this DB context class. DB context class track, yes, this data entry, this record is updated, this record is added, this record is deleted, right? So all these informations are tracking by this DB context class, right? So change tracking means whatever the change you made to your entities, that is what is going to be keep track by this DB context class. So if you are fetching one data, right, and you just delete that data by calling the remove method. Suppose, for example, you fetch one student whose ID is 10, then you call this dbset.delete, and you pass that student information, right? Then in that case, what will happen? It will mark that this entity is being deleted. And if you add one a new entity to the DB set, to the DB context, right, then it will mark that this is a new entity being added. So the entity state is going to be added. The entity, if you modify one of the existing entity, right, modify in the sense you update some of the properties of that entity, then it will mark that entity state is modified. And if you fetch one entity and you do not do anything with that entity, then it will mark that entity state is unchanged. Unchanged means we have not done any kind of a changes, right? So those kind of a tracking, right, tracking information is going to be handled by this DB context class. Database operations, right? So once it handle, right, once it manage what is the entity state, whether the entity state is updated, modified, inserted, deleted. And then if you want to make these changes permanent on the database, then what we need to do, you just need to call the save changes method. And once you call the save changes method, then based on the entity state, whatever the entity state, the corresponding SQL statement is going to be generated by the database provider, right? For example, if the entity state is added, then for that entity, it is going to generate insert SQL statement. If the entity state is modified, then it is going to generate the object statement. If entity state is deleted, it is going to generate the delete SQL statement. And that is only possible when you call this save changes method. If you are not calling the save changes method, means those changes are in your .NET application, but not in the database. So first of all, guys, you have to remember two things. See, if you modify the data in your application, .NET application, means it is only in memory. It is not made permanent to the database. Only when it is going to be made permanent into the database, means when the changes are reflected in the database, when you call the save changes method, right? Clear, guys? Clear or not?
Yes, sir.
Yes. This configuration means what for whatever the class, what is the corresponding database table, right? What should be the right property name, right? If you are creating a table with a student, but you want to create that database table as my student, that configuration, right? If you want to write and say again, there is something. If you want to make sure what should be the database, right? Where the database is created, all the information, whether you want to use caching or not, what schema you want to use. I want to schema DBO. I want to use the schema, right? Admin, anything, any kind of a configuration you want to do, that is also possible as part of the DB context class, right? So coring means, right, if you want to execute some kind of a complex LinQ queries, right, joining two database object, right, so that it is going to perform the joining operation on two different tables, right, grouping the data, filtering the data, sorting the data, right. Or for that purpose, we generally using LinQ queries, right? Along with LinQ, right, you can also use LinQ to entity framework core, so that the corresponding SQL script is going to be generated and executed on the database, right? Here you can write the join method to join two classes, but internally that join, whatever the join operation you perform using LinQ, that will be converted into SQL queries, and that is going to be executed on the database. That coring optionality is also available. Lazy loading means what? Right, we are going to discuss this lazy loading in detail, right? So lazy loading means what? Now, whenever we are loading the main entity data, loads the related entity data from the database when the navigation property is being accessed, right? So for example, right, so for example, one order is there, order ID, order name, order amount, order date. Along with that order information, one application collection property is there, list of items, right? So what is your responsibility? Whenever you are loading the order item data, do you want to load the corresponding order, right? Whenever you are loading the order data, do you want to load the corresponding order items at the same time? Do you want to load the items whenever you access that order items property for the first time? What is your requirement? No, no. I don't want to load all the data whenever I'm accessing the order items property. At that only I need to get the data. Yes, that is possible. That concept is called lazy loading, delaying the loading of the related entity. Other option is eager loading. Eager loading means what? Whenever you are loading the main entity data, the corresponding navigation, right, corresponding entity can also be loaded. That concept is called eager loading. Again, practically, I will show you what is lazy loading, what is eager loading, what is explicit loading, right? All these things we are also going to discuss. Caching means what? Right? The DP context class provides the first level of caching. What it means? It means, suppose you are executing one query multiple times and you want to paste the same data again and again. That means the query is going to be same. If the query is going to be same again and again, then in that case, it is not going to execute the query on the database. Rather than it uses something called first level caching. From the cache itself, it is going to return the data instead of querying the data in the database. So this can improve your application performance. Again, guys, remember this is only the first level of caching. Unit of work means, right, if you want to execute multiple DML statements as a single unit, means if you want to ensure either execute everything or don't execute anything, right? If one of the statement in the transaction, right, one of the DML statements fail, please roll back all the transaction, all the statements. That means if you want to implement a transaction, then also this DB context class you need to use. Connection management, right? As we already discussed, right? When to open the database connection, when to close the database connection, right? All these things are going to be managed by the DB context class. Migration, we have already discussed, right? How it is going to manage the migrations, right? Practically, again, I'm going to discuss. Relationship management means when to use, right? Whenever you are specifying, right? The model classes, whether, and there is a primary key, foreign key relationships, then in that case, it is also going to decide whether I need to generate one-to-one relationship between the database table or one-to-many or many-to-many. How the relationship is going to be managed by the different database tables, that is what also going to be managed by the DB context class. Database provider agnostic means what? Now, when using DB context, your code will be compatible with the multiple databases, right? What it means, Now the data context, the DB context class, what we are going to use to write our data .NET application code, right? It is not specific to any particular database. The database might be SQL Server, PostgreSQL, SQLite, MySQL, Oracle, whatever may be the database, but our code, DB context code, is going to be same, right? The same code is going to work with different database provider and the different database backend database. Clear, guys? Any particular subtopic, right? Any particular or meaning you are not understanding, you can ask me. Clear or not, guys?
Clear, sir.
Yes, sir, it's clear.
Okay. Now let us understand how we can create that DB context class in our ASP.NET Core applications, right? Okay, so basically whatever I'm going to do at the root directory, I'm creating a folder called entities. So I click and I create a folder called entities. Inside this folder, I'm going to create my entities. Right. So inside this folder, I'm going to create my required entities. So basically what I'm going to develop, I'm going to develop an application for the student management, right, of a school. So for this purpose, I'm going to write two class files. One is student.cs, another one is standard.cs. And along the same line, I also want to implement the relationship between the student and the standard classes. So let me create a class file with the name student.cs within this entities folder, because see, before using this DB context class, we also need to make sure we are having some entities. So this is my student.cs class. Then I just copy paste this code, right? So I just copy paste this code, and you can see the student class. First of all, you can see I'm using something called a data annotation schema, and what is this name? Right? Okay. Right. So this namespace we are getting this error, no worry, because we have not created this class. Let me first create the class, then I will explain the code. Add class file standard.keyboard. We have create another class with the name standard. Let me copy paste this code. Okay. So this is my standard entity having few properties and one collection and application property. And this is my standard entity, and the standard entity having few properties as well, right? So guys, remember from our data annotation session, I have told you data annotation can not only used with a validation purpose, but also they can be used whenever we are working with an entity framework code. Right. So here you can see I have applied some data annotation attribute. Let me explain this code. This is a student class having this ID, first name, last name, date of birth properties. And here you can see I'm having one decimal property. So what should be the column type in the database, right? If you are using this decimal, right, data type, then you need to tell what should be the type, means how many precision and scale you want to use in the database. And here you can see I have specified 18,4, and this is another float type property, right? Again, it's a decimal value. So you need to specify what should be the precision and the scale. And here guys, remember this student, and within the student, I'm having one reference property. So this is reference property, as it's a reference property, right? So that means what? Now in the database, it is going to make one-to-one relationship between student and the standard. That means one student belongs to a single standard. And if you come to the standard entity, right, you can see this is the standard ID, standard name, standard description, and students. Means what? Now this is a standard, and this is a reference navigation property. So guys, remember this is this is reference navigation property, and this is collection and application property. So whenever you are using one collection application property, then it is going to implement one-to-many relationship between the entities. So means what? one standard having many students. That means here one to many relationship between standard and student. And in this case, you can see one standard, right? As you are using here reference navigation property, one standard having or one standard belongs to a single, one student belongs to a single standard. That means in this case, it is going to represent what kind of a relationship between student and standard? One to one. Between standard and student, it is going to be one to many. So basically, in this case, it is going to represent one to many relationship between these two entities. Clear, guys?
Sir, I have one question. Why there is any specific purpose to use virtual in standard that
Yes, there is some reason that what I'm going to discuss later, right? So basically, if you want to make this as a virtual, it is going to generate the foreign key. Right, I will discuss this virtual keyword, right? Once you start discussing, right, everything I'm going to explain why virtual, right? Because the virtual, you just tell me what is the use of virtual keyword. If you want to override something, then you need
yes,
to mark that property as virtual, right?
yes.
Again, in this case, right, if you are using virtual, there is some specific reason. Intentionally I'm putting this as virtual, right? Because if I'm not putting this as virtual, then what will happen? That is what we are also going to discuss in detail, right? Don't worry about why I'm making this property as virtual, right? So we'll discuss this thing, right? That is also part of this course syllabus. Everything, right? Everything I'm going to discuss why I'm making this property as virtual. If I'm not making this as property as virtual, then what problem I will face? All these things, as we progress, gradually you will understand, right? So, so we have created these two classes. One is student, another one is standard. And here between standard and student, one to many. And here between student and standard, that is one to one relationship. So we have created these two entities in our application. And what we want to create a two database table in the database representing student and standard. And also they should represent, right, the relationship between them, right? So to do this, what we need to do, we need to create the context class, right? So we have to create the context class. Let me create a class file with the name entity framework core db context class within this folder, right? So add a class file entity framework core context class. Let me copy this code, then I will explain this code. Okay. Right. So this is the skeleton, or you can say this is the basic structure, what you can say. So first of all, your class should be inherited from the DB context class. Until unless it is not inherited, you will not consider this as a context class. This is the parameter-less constructor, which is calling the base parameter-less constructor. Means the DB context class constructor, which is not taking any parameter. And here you can see we are having two methods. One is on configuring and another one is on model creating. So using this on configuring method, you need to provide the data source. You need to configure the data source, where the data source is, right? That what information you need to provide within this on configuring method. On model creating means, do you want to modify this model? Means modifying means using Fluent API, right? Do you want to specify what should be the table name, what should be the property name, what should be the property order in the database, right? Any kind of validation, all these things, do you want to specify? Yes, I want to specify. That what you can do within this on model creating method. But here you need to use Fluent API. Right, all these things we are going to discuss everything in detail as we progress in this course, right? I will show you how to use this method. I will show you how to use this method, and I will also show you how to use this method, right? So now what is my intention? My intention is to create a table called standards, right? Here the class name is standard, but I want to create the table name as standards, and I want to create the table name as students in the database. That is what we need to configure, right? Remember, from the beginning, I have told you, if you are having 100 classes, do you want to create tables for all those 100 classes? No, I don't want. I want to create tables for few classes, and whatever classes you want, right, the corresponding database table for which you need to specify them as a DB set of properties. So here DB set is a collection, right? And within this collection, you need to add the corresponding model entities which you want, for which you want to create the classes. So this is nothing but it is a collection. Within this collection, you need to add the entity. So here I have added DB set of T entity. Here T entity is nothing but your student, and here T entity is nothing but standard. So in this case, what will happen in the database, right? In the database, it is going to create a table with this name. What should be the table name? Table name is going to be students, and that table is going to be mapped with your student model, right? So in this case, whenever you are going to perform any operation within your data, within your application using student, and whenever you call the set changes or anything, any method, right? In that case, it is going to fetch the data from the students. And if you are inserting, updating, deleting anything using the student entity, again, it is going to perform the same operation on the student database table. And same in the case of the standard. Means in the database, it is going to create the table with this name standards, and but this standards table which is going to be created in the database is mapped with this standard entity of our application. So using the standard entity, you can fetch the data, you can store the data, you can perform the CRUD operations. But whenever you are performing the CRUD operation and whenever the SQL statement is going to be generated, those statements is going to be operated on the standards database table. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right. So in the database, it is going to create the table with this name, right? For any entity you want to create a database table, you need to register them within this DB context class using the DB set properties. Clear, guys?
Yeah.
Right. So now this DB context class having many method, right? If you go to this context class, then you will see this context class having many method and properties, right? So let me call up to this definition. Right, you can see add, attach, remove, add, range, find, sync, remove, update, right? Many methods. Let us try to have a look at all these methods, and then we will create a simple example, and with that example we will complete our today's session, right? So add method means if you want to add a new entity, then you need to use this add method, and the entity is going to be added with the state added, and whenever we call this changes method for added state, the database, the database provider is going to generate insert SQL statement, and this is nothing but the async version of the same thing, right? Add async, and in this case, if you are using add async, means you need to use set changes async, right? So whenever we are going to work with async controller, async action methods, right? In that case, we need to use this add async and set changes async method. Then if you want to add multiple, right? If you want to perform the batch operations, right? If you want to add multiple entities, then you need to use this add range or add range async method. Again, when you call the set changes method, the actual data is going to be updated in the database. Attach means if you want to add an entity with unchanged state, then you need to use this attach. And again, if you want to add multiple entities or a collection of entities, then you need to use add attach range. Entry means if you want to manually set the entity state, right? You created one entity and you manually want to set the entity state as added, modified, updated, deleted, right? Then in that case, you need to use this entry method. Find method means based on the primary key, if you want to find a record from the database, you need to use this find method. And this find async means this is the async version of this find method. Remove means what? If you want to delete a entity from the database, right? Then you need to use this remove method, and on calling of this step changes method, the entity is going to be deleted from the database. Remove range means if you want to remove a range of entities. Step changes method, right? Whenever we call this step changes or step changes async method based on the entity state, right? It might be one entity, two entity, five entities, right? One entity with insert statement, two entity with update statement, three entity with deleted state. It might be like that, right? But whatever the entity state, for each corresponding entity, the required insert update delete statement is going to be executed and generated and executed on the database, right? So object means if you attach on disconnected entity with modified state and tracking it, right? If you are what is connected entity, what is disconnected entity, that what we are going to discuss in detail. Similarly, object range means if you want to update a range of entities. On configuring method means using this on configuring method, you can configure your database provider. Means what database server you need to use, what should be the database name, right? All those information you need to provide using this one. On model creating means using Fluent API validation, if you want to provide some kind of a customization to your model or model properties, then in that case, you need to go with model on model creating. Again, let's remember, we can do this thing in two different ways. You can do the same thing using data annotations as well as using Fluent API. I'm going to show you both of the options, right? So the point that what you need to remember is DP context is the heart of your .NET Core application. So without DP context, you can't do anything, right? So once we understand the DP context class, then what we need to do is we need to see one simple example, right? So guys, remember, we need to understand database, right? So for that purpose, you should have installed SQL Server on your machine. So I have already installed SQL Server, right? Let me open the SQL Server Management Studio to see what will be the connection string. See, this is my SQL Server and I click on the connect button. So once I click on the connect button, this database is get connected, right? So my SQL Server is ready. Then what I'm going to do, I'm going to write the connection strings, right? So we are right. So the database connection string, you can specify in many different places. You can use app settings, you can use environment variable, command line, argument, user settings, right? All these options are available, but the best option is app settings.json file, right? So this is similar to your web config file, what you used in your earlier .NET Framework application. But before using this app settings.json file, let me show you how you can do the same thing manually, right? So without using app settings, right? My currently, if you look at this application, there is no app settings.json file, right? Even though if you are working with a console application with the .NET Framework, right? Then in that case, you will find app settings.json file. If you are developing web application, you will find web config file. But these things are not available with your .NET Core application. So let me first show you how you can do the configuration manually, right? How you can provide the information manually, and then I will show you how you can do the same thing using the method, right? So guys, remember within this configuration method, right? Within this DF core DB context class, on which method we need to provide the connection string? Do we need to provide the connection string in on configuring method or on model creating? Where we need to provide the connection string?
On configuring.
Right. So this unconfiguring is basically for configuring your data source, and on model creating method is basically used to configure your model using the Fluent API. Now we need to write the string connection string here, right? So for providing the connection string, right, what we need to do is we need to use the option builder class. So you can see this is the option builder class, and using this option builder class, we are having one method called use SQL Server. Right. So using this SQL Server method, what we need to do, we need to provide the connection string of our application, right? So connection string, right? So to check what is the server name, this is my server name. I just copy the server name and I have pasted it here. So this is my server name. Then I want to create a database with the name EFA Core TP1. Whatever name you want, you can give here. I want to use trusted connection proof because right, this trusted connection proof means it is going to use Windows authentication, and I trust the SQL Server certificate, that is true, right? So once I provide this information, what it means our SQL Server, right, our connection string is ready, right? We have installed the required entity from our core libraries from the NuGet. We have created our model classes, or you can say entities. We configure the entities within the DBSet class. We also configure the, what we configure? We configure the connection string. Now everything is ready. So it's time to write what I need to tell. It's time to generate the SQL Server script, and it's time to, what I can say, create the database, right? So for creating the database, it is not that straightforward. So what, don't think that I run the application and once I run the application, the corresponding database table structure, all these things are going to be created. This is not the case. It is not entity framework. In entity framework, auto migration is there, right? Once you write the code and once you run the application, automatically everything is going to be happen behind the scene. But this is not the case with the entity framework code. Here we have to use something called migration. Using this migration, we need to generate the SQL statement, what changes we have made to our DB context class, and accordingly it will generate one version of the migration file. And based on that migration only, it is going to what? It is going to generate the SQL Server statement. So what we need to do? So if you remember, right, how to install, right? If you remember, yes. So if you remember, we have something, this command, and for you to use this command, what tool we have installed? We have installed EFA core tools. Do you have installed that tool? Yes, we have already installed that EFA core tools. That means as we have installed this tool, right, then what we can do is we can use this PowerShell command in our package manager console, right? So to add a migration file, what command do we need to use? We need to use add migration command. So let us first use this command and see how it is going to create, right? So for that purpose, what we need to do, we need to first let me build the application to check whether is there any error or not. Yes, there is no error. So as there is no error, then what we need to do, we need to open package manager console, right? So, right, let me clear the screen. CLS command to clear the screen. And then what we need to do, we need to use this add migration command, and then we need to provide the migration file name. So what I'm going to do, I'm using this add migration command, and once you provide this add migration command, then you need to give a unique name. That name should not be used earlier. If it is used earlier, then it will not create. It will give compilation error, right? So currently we have not created any migration. First time we are creating the migration, so there is no issue, right? So once you provide this add migration command and click on this create EF code DB1, EF code DB1, right? This is nothing but your migration name. Then click on the enter button. So once you click on the enter button, it will start building your application. If build successful, then it will create the command, right? And again, it is saying if you want to remove this migration, you can use this remove migration command. So we are not going to remove the command at this point, right? But once this statement is successfully executed, then you will see this migration folder being created, right? So this migration folder you can see here, and this folder is going to be created with two files. What are all these two files? We will discuss later. But you can see one file is EF core DB1, that what name we have provided. Before that, it is adding some right date time value to specify this is the latest version. And another one is a snapshot. If you open this migration command file, right, then right? If you open this migration command file, then you will see this command. So in this case, you can see it is containing some of the statements, right? So these statements is basically, you can see create table. So create table statements means it is going to create a table called standard in the database, and that table having these properties. One is standard ID, standard name, description. It also contains a foreign key. Foreign key name is PK standard. It is also going to create a table called students. This table student having this right columns, right? And you can see here we have specified data type using string, but that string is converted to your .NET data type, right? So if you are using datetime, it is converting to datetime T. The string is converted to embarker of max, right? Again, the student ID, it is making this as a identity column with the seed and seed value, and if value is 1 and 1. Right? Again, this table having the constant PK student, and this table also having the primary key, that is primary key, and also having the foreign key. This foreign key means it is making one-to-many relationship. Again, in this case, it is also going to create some, right? What it is going to create, it is also going to create the indexes, right? Indexes on the students table as well as on the standard ID column. Again, this down means if you want to remove, right, remove the migration, then it is going to remove the students and the standard table from the database. So this is for remove purpose, and this is whenever you add the migration up and remove. Up and down means remove, up means this is going to be added or modified into the database. So by guys, remember, once you generate the migration, don't think that database is created. Once you generate this migration command, don't think that the database is generated. If you go and refresh the database, then you will see there's no database called EF Core DB1. Right? So the point that you need to remember, this add migration command is basically used to generate the command, right? Which is going to be, right, generate SQL statement at runtime. But if you want to update this command, right, whatever the things happening here, right, if you want to apply, if you want to make changes, these things, right, to the database, then what you need to do is you need to use this updated database command. Right? You need to use updated database command. So once this updated database command is successfully executed, then that means the command, whatever this migration file contains, those are going to be applied on the database. And once that update command, right, update database command executed successfully, then only it is going to create the database. If not already created, in this case, if you see, right, this context class, whatever the database name we provided, if database is already created, then the things are going to be modified. If it is not already created, it will first create the database and then it is going to make these changes to the database. Let us try to see how we can apply these things, right? Right. So what we need to do, we can use update database verbose. Right. So what exactly this verbose command, can anybody tell me? So we understand update database, but what exactly, right? We need to write update database. So based on the latest migration file, it is going to update the database. Along with this, you can also specify the migration, right, file name like EF Core DB1 also here, and that migration file is going to be updated into the database. That's fine. But what exactly this verbose command? Can anybody tell me what is the use of this command? Okay. So if you use this verbose command, then here it will log what SQL statements are generated and executed on the database. If you remove these things, right, then it will not log anything, right? Let me show you these things, right? So update database verbose, and once I provided this thing, and once you press the enter button, right, then you will see all those things, right? Whatever the statements are generated, whatever the statements are executed, right? You can see create the index, right? Insert statement, right? Migration history table is there, right? Creating the students table, creating the students, right? All these things are going to be creating the standard table, right? Whatever the SQL statement generated, that what you can see, and here you can see it is applying this migration, right? Because this is the latest migration, that is what we have created. You can also, once you create multiple migration, then you can specify any migration that what you want to update, right, the database. That is also what we are also going to discuss in our coming session. But once you execute these things, right, then you can verify what SQL statements is generated and executed on the database, right? Now, if you go to the database and if you refresh this folder, right, then you will see EF Core DB1 is getting created. Now, if you expand these things, then you will see there is a table called the migration history, right? Whatever all the migration that we created, all the information it's going to be captured, right? You can see this is migration ID and whatever the name, right? Why I'm saying you should give a unique name, because this is the primary key. So duplicate name is not allowed. And what is the product version? Product version means what is the entity framework or what used, right, to create this migration file, that version name it is shown, right? So if you see what entity framework version it is created 7.0.11. So 7.0.1, and this is migration ID. It's nothing but your migration name. See, the second part, create a core DB1, that what we are provided. The first part, right, what this is nothing but here current date time. The current date time underscore the migration name, that what we provided, you can see here, right? So this table is created, and again you can see this is my standard table, and if you look the standard table, this is the column, standard ID, standard name, and the description, and you can see the name. So whatever name we specify in the entity we specify standard. But why it is created as standards? This is because of this configuration. Whatever configuration we specify that, and same in the case of students. You can see it is creating students, right? And again, if you see the standard ID of the student table created as a foreign key pointing to the standard table, standard ID column. So this is nothing but your foreign key. So what is primary key? What is foreign key? How we can modify the table name? How we can modify the column name? How to create a primary key? How to create a primary key other than integer? How to disable the identity column? All these things we are going to discuss in detail. Don't worry. But for now, just the basic concepts, right? So guys, understand what exactly, right, these things, how you can use this command to generate. And if you are using .NET Core CLI, means if you are developing the application using .NET Core CLI, then in that case, you need to use .EF4 data. But remember one more thing, right? So you need to generate the command again and again whenever you modify the model classes or your EDMX file. For example, in this case, if you add few more columns, right, then again you need to create the migration file, and again you need to update the database command. Until and unless you are not creating a migration file, updating the right database command, the changes are not going to be reflected into the database. Clear, guys? Okay. Now let me show you a simple example to understand how exactly this is going to work. So first of all, who is the heart of your .NET Core application? Entity Framework or DB context. If you want to do any kind of operation on the database, first of all, you need to create a session with the database. For creating a session with the database, what you need to do, you need to create an instance of this Entity Framework or DB context class. Once you create an instance of an Entity Framework or DB context class, then it will take the responsibility to open the connection, close the connection, execute the database command, fetch the data, whatever you want, that what it is going to do, right? So let me show you one thing, right? So first of all, I'm creating one instance, right? Using the I'm creating one Entity Framework core instance, right? So the instance is created. Once the instance is created, right, then what I'm doing, I'm creating a new object. I'm creating a new student object. So student object is created. So on this context object, there is a property called students, right? If you go to this class, there once I create an instance of this class, so there is a property called students, there is a property called standards. So within the students property, what I'm using this add method, right? So I'm using this add method. This add method belongs to Entity Framework or DB context class. What this add method is going to do, it will mark this entity state as added state. So basically, you can see another option is also there. I think that will also work. Directly, you can also add the students. That is also possible, right? So here you can add students collection dot add to make sure the student is a student entity. And in this case, based on the type, it is also automatically going to check what kind of data entity is this and where I need to add. So both are going to be same, right? So once you add this statement, right, what will happen? The entity is going to be tracked by this context class. The DB context class tracking that entity. Which entity? The entity whose name is Pranaya Rout and whatever value we specified. And whenever it is tracking means it will track that entity with a particular state. And in this case, as we are adding this entity to the student collection, or you can say adding this entity to the DB context instance, and as this entity we are adding using the add method, so it will mark this entity as which state, guys? Added state. Right? We will discuss what are the different state, how you can manage the state, all these things. But internally, it will mark the entity state as added state. But guys, remember, if it is using the entity state as added state, then what SQL statement is it is going to generate? Internally, it is going to generate the insert SQL statement, right? It is going to generate the insert SQL statement. But adding the entity to the context class means it is only being tracked by the context object. It is not added to the database. And when it is going to add it to the database? when you call this step changes method. So once we call this step changes method, then it will check what all entities are being tracked by this context object. So this is one entity, and another entity might be there, right, which is in a different state, right? So what all entities are being tracked by the context object, and for each entity, it is going to generate the corresponding SQL statement. And in this case, as we are having only one entity called student, so that student entity is in added state. So it is going to generate the insert SQL statement. Later, as we progress, then I will show you, right, what exactly the SQL statement generated. That what we can also look at, but not now, but once we progress in this session. Not in this session, in our coming session. So with these changes, now let me run the application and see whether the entity is being added to the database or not. So you can see this message student added successfully. Now, if you go and check this entity student table, right, then you will see that student ID, that first name, last name, and whatever the data we have provided, those are being added into the database. Clear, guys? Clear or not?
Yes, sir.
So that's it for today. Tomorrow, I'm going to show you how you can use app-settings.json file to read the data and the corresponding concept, right? So we are going to discuss how to perform the CRUD operation, what are entity state, link to entities, and all these things we are going to discuss one by one. So that's it for today, right? So any question, guys, from anyone, they can ask me now. Any question, guys, from anyone?
Sir, we can add multiple entity at the same time, right? Like we have added only a student, first name, last name, and height and weight.
Any entity, right? So let me add few more entities. Student 1, this is student 2, right? This is student 3, right? So these are 3 entities, right? So I'm adding student 1, right? So you can add student 2 and student 3 as well. Student 2 and student 3. Now run the application Pranaya. So I'm giving the same name, you have to modify the name. Right now, verify the database and see all the entities are being added. And this is the primary key, right? So if you remember the migration file, right? If you remember the migration file, this column is created as identity column. This is the reason why automatically the value is being added. Later, I will show you how you can disable the identity, right? All these things are also possible, right? We will discuss them one by one. But today's session is just about the introduction, what exactly the entity framework and how you can install and use entity framework in your .NET Core application. That's clear, guys? Clear, or anybody having any question?
In real time, which approach will we use? Means
Which approach
database
means?
first or class first approach?
See, first of all, you need to understand which approach, that doesn't important. Important is how you are going to use entity framework, right? So the approach is basically used to create the model classes and what I can say databases. If your database is already ready-made available, you already the DBA team is there who are creating the database and database is ready, then definitely you need to create the model classes based on the database. If you are right, in that case, see, particularly you need to decide what is already there. Already database is created, then definitely you need to go with the database first approach. But if your database is not created and you want that based on my model classes, the database should created, I'm not that good at the database side. I'm good at entity framework core. I'm good at C#, and I want the database to be created from my model classes. In that case, you need to go with the code first approach, right? But once you use the code first and model first, right? Whether you use the code first approach or model first approach, right? The context class is going to be same, right? This context class we are creating, right? And based on this context class, right, the database is created. And if you are working with the database first approach, based on your database, this context class is going to be created for us. And later, as we progress, right, whenever we are going to perform the database operations, we are only going to use this context class and model for this. Clear?
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Right? So you can say, okay, which approach is best. It's depend on your particular requirement, and it's depend on your experience, right? Already if database is created, why you are going to create the classes, maintaining the relationship and all these things? Directly you can make use of a database first approach. Model classes will be ready in some minutes. But if your database is not created and you are not good at database side, then definitely you will prefer to use this code first approach. Okay. Any more question, guys, from anyone?
Sir, I have one question. In the
Yes.
not student, in the standard model, what
Sorry?
is the use of the collection in the standard model entity?
And see, basically what I'm trying to make you is, right? So if you want to generate, right, one-to-many relationships, right? So basically, see, let me tell you one thing. So I'm having one order class, right? And
Yes.
I'm having one class called order. And I'm having another class is item, right? And I want to represent, right, one order having many items. Then how you can represent that? What type of property you need to create in this class?
Collections.
So if you are creating a collection, means what? So you need to create something like this. You need to create some public, right, list of what I can say, item. And you can say something like this. Yes or no?
Yes.
So in this case, what is the relationship between these two?
One-to-many.
Means one order having many items,
Yes. But
right?
in the this what
So you see, let me first explain this thing. That means what? Now, whenever you are designing the database, in one database table, you are going to store the order information, right? And in another database table, you are going to store the items information, right? And if you want to make sure that this particular item belongs to this particular order, then you need to make a primary key, foreign key relationship between these two tables or not. Without making any relationship, can you specify that this item belongs to this particular order?
No.
Then how you are going to maintain that in the database side? Definitely, you
Right.
will say that this is my primary key, order table order ID is the primary key, and I want to use that order ID primary key column inside my items table. There will be created one column called order ID, and there I will store that order ID. So once I make this relationship, then I can say frankly that this item belongs to this order. Yes or no?
Yes.
So this is how, if you want to implement, right, means what? If you want to create this kind of a relationship in the database, then you need to use this collection properties.
But in the migration file, it will be skipped, right? Last column.
It will not skip, right? So say in this migration file, so do you think that it is going to create one column with the name students? Does it make any sense to create a column with this name students?
No.
So means what? So we are creating this collection property to make sure it is going to generate a primary key foreign key relationship between two entities. And if you go to this migration table, right, you can see this is my right foreign key constant. Right, so what will be the right? This is my student table, and this students table having a column called standard ID. It is going to create a column standard ID, which is going to be the primary key, which is the primary key in the standard table. So in this case, you can see principal table is standard, principal column is standard ID, and this column that is going to be created in the standard in the student table, and this standard ID column of student table will pointing to the standards database table student ID. Now, if you go and check, right, in the students database, right, if you generate the script, then you will see the same thing. It will generate one column with the name standard ID, You can see this is my standard ID column, right? Not this one. This is the standard ID column, right? And it is pointing to the foreign key standard ID, right? So this is how it is generated. So this is referencing to the standards table, standard ID column, and this standard ID column in the students table will be created as a foreign key, and that will be pointing to the primary key of the standard table. So that is what, right? This is how we are implementing the primary key and foreign key relationship. First of all, this is my principal entity. And here you can see this is my standard ID column, and I want this standard ID column as a foreign key inside my students table. That means the students table standard ID column should pointing to the standards table standard ID column. And that is what if you want to implement, then you want to implement something like this. So here you need to create this as a collection navigation property so that, right, this particular standard ID can have many students, right? So standard ID means what? Standard ID in the sense what? The standard one. So in standard one, how many students are studying? So all the simple students are going to be the same standard ID. So in standard two, right? So if you are developing one application, do you think that I'm going to create one database table to store standard one student information, another table to store standard two information? No, it is not like that. I can create a standard table having the information standard ID 1, 2, 3 up to 10. And I can create one single database table where I'm going to store the all the student information, right? And based on the standard ID, I can fetch, right? Whichever students are studying in a particular standard, I can easily fetch. Clear or not?
Yes, sir.
Right? So to implement this, we need to use. And again, if you want to make the primary key foreign key relationship one to many, in that case, you also need to decide, right? So based on which property the primary key is going to be, foreign key is going to be created based on the standard. So whenever I specify the standard, so based on the standard table, primary key automatically by default. See, once we progress, then I will discuss what is the default convention configuration followed by the entity framework to create the primary key, default configuration followed by entity framework to create the foreign key, how we can modify this default configuration, how we can specify our own configuration. All these things we are going to discuss one by one. Clear, guys? Even if you want, you can modify this decimal 18.4 to 18.2, all these thing changes you can also do here. And then when you update this migration, then whatever changes you have done in this file that are going to be reflected into the database. That is also possible. Right? So all these things we are going to discuss step by step. So this is the reason why I'm not creating any MVC or web API application. I want to explain you the core concept using a console application so that your focus will be on the core concept, not on the controller action method, that program file configuration, view, all these things, right? So we want to keep focus on the core concept. This is the reason why I'm taking console application. But definitely, once you understand the core concept, I will use this core concept in your MVC and WebAPI application because the concept is going to be same. The way we are working with the entity framework in console application, it is not going to be vary from application to application. The same process, same steps. Everything is going to be same, right? So this is how you need to create. Clear, guys?
Sir, could you please go to DB connection, constant class? Yes. Sir, here, if line number 26, if you see, here the standard will be my parent, right?
Sorry,
And
line number?
26.
What is the parent?
Standard means from
Why it is a parent?
means
What is
I'm
the
using
meaning of parent?
primary key and foreign key, right? Standard primary key I'm using in the student.
See, here you do not worry about what is the primary key and foreign key. That primary key, foreign key, you need to configure inside your model only. Right? Here, you are just telling that please create a table with the name students in the database, which is mapped with the student entity. That's it. Nothing more. Whatever configuration you have done within this student entity using data annotation, and or if you want to do configuration using model creating, that is a separate story altogether. But here, the main objective is what the model, right, for which, what are the model for which you want to create the database step. That is what you need to specify here. We are specifying this one, right? If you remove one, then that is not going to be created. in the database, right? So whatever database tables you want to create, that what you need to specify as a DB set of a T entity property,
Okay.
right? And which one is the primary key, which one is the foreign, that configuration you need to do only within this your model classes, right? Here you can see by default, see what I'm saying, right? Why it is creating the standard ID as the primary key, why it is not creating this as the primary key. All these things we will discuss, right? If you remember, so all these things, what is the key attribute, primary key, foreign key, right? Index, inverse property, right? All these things we are going to discuss, right? But not now, right? There are some logic behind this. If I am creating this ID and if I am creating this as a standard ID, then this will create as a primary key. But if there is no ID or standard ID column, right, property in your table, then it will give you some compilation error. If
Yes.
it is, if you want to create that, no, I don't want to follow the default convention configuration. I want to follow my own convention and config. That is also possible. Everything we are going to discuss, but step by step. Clear?
Okay.
Right? So it is going to be at least 7 to 10 days classes. So don't think that in the same in one class you will understand every concept, right? So once we are just starting and are to the end, right? Definitely you will understand each and every concept. That guarantee I can give. Clear, guys?
Sir, one question, sir. Sir, in code
Yes.
first approach, we don't have any database, so we need to mention all the foreign key primary concept. But in
See,
DB first
code
approach,
first, you just tell me what do you mean by code first approach? Code first approach means based on your model classes, you are generating the database.
right? But
So
in DB,
definitely,
yeah,
yeah,
in database first approach, we have all the tables, right, and relation all as well. So that time we
it is.
don't need to mention this
So
relationship
in
here.
that time, so you just tell me, in that time, do you think that I am going to create the student and standard entities?
No.
Automatically, that student and standard entities is going to be created by the database provider, right? So we do not need to create this thing. These classes, this student entity, standard entity, this DB context class, right? Everything is going to be generated automatically based on the database. In that case, we do not need to do anything.
Okay, sir.
Right, so this is not no more different than entity framework. If you work with the entity framework, then this should not be a case, right? So you know how entity framework is working and how this entity framework code, right? Yes, the working principle is going to be little bit different. The way, but the main objective it is going to be same.
Okay, sir.
Okay. Any more question, guys, or shall I stop the session? Thank you, guys.